This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. In March 2014, Steve and Jo Dew-Jones traveled to the bottom of South America and began hitchhiking north. In November, they arrived in Homer, Alaska, after traveling over 26,000 miles with 392 drivers. Their only rule was to hitchhike and not use paid transportation. They wrote a book about the adventure titled The Rule of Thumb 2, which you can learn more about at ruleofthumb2.wordpress.com. Steve and Jo, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hello.
Hi, Paul.
My first question would be, why did you want to go on this hitchhiking adventure?
Well, it's probably predominantly because I'd done a previous one, hence the rule of thumb 2. So the rule of thumb 1, or just the rule of thumb, was a hitchhike I did from England to Malaysia in 2008 with a good friend of mine. So this was kind of the follow-up. And in terms of sort of why you'd want to do anything like that in the first place, I suppose it's only really just an adventure. So the sense of an adventure, doing an adventure. And then once I'd done the one, I always wanted to do another one, particularly because I'd enjoyed the hitchhiking aspect so much.
Jo, are you naturally adventurous? I'm wondering how much arm twisting did Steve have to do to bring you along on this rule of thumb 2?
Yes, I think I'd say it was a slow burn. Steve had brought up the idea about 8 years before we actually did it. Was it that long? Maybe...
No, it would have been about 6.
6 years. And at the time, I was completely opposed, having seen Steve go and hitchhike for 7 months with a friend and been parted from him for that long. But over the years, I gradually got used to it. Also really enjoying being in different cultures and meeting other people. And also not really knowing what I was getting myself into probably helped quite a lot.
About the route, was South America your very first choice and it was a no-brainer, or did you have other parts of the world in mind?
I think if you look at a map, then having done England to Malaysia, which is sort of about as far as you can go west to east, not quite, but a fair way west to east, then it seemed quite logical to do a kind of south to north or north to south, and that is actually the very furthest you can go, south to north. So yeah, it seemed like a bit of a no-brainer, I think.
You know, when I was reading through your blog, one of the things that I hadn't really thought about was the fact that hitchhiking might change from region to region, whether that be the gestures, how the locals react to it, and so on. How did that affect your journey?
We had to learn as we were going along, which was part of the fun, part of the confusion and the chaos of hitchhiking. When we started, it was clear that hitchhiking was part of the culture of particularly Argentina and Chile. There were lots of other people hitchhiking, and it was very easy. Following on from there, we found that because we stood out being Westerners in South America, that helped as well. So even if our gestures weren't quite right, it was fairly clear what we were up to. Moving on into Central America, there were lots of truckers from other countries, as well as the countries we were traveling through. And again, we would talk to people about what the right Spanish word was or the Portuguese word was for hitchhiking, how we could explain our journey. And then into America, the language was no longer a barrier, but the attempt to hitchhike was something fairly rare. So again, we were adapting all the way up to the very end.
Can you give me an example of, like, everybody in the U.S. knows the gesture, you stick your thumb out, but what's an example of a totally different gesture?
I'd actually go to Iran for a completely different, which obviously was a different trip. So that was my first trip. And there, sticking out your thumb is actually quite rude, strangely. So, and you only know that if you've been there or spoken to someone from there. But so there you kind of flap your hand in a kind of up and down motion to the side. And that's the way to signal. Normally a taxi, but you can just about get it across. But I think, for this particular trip, I remember clearly on the last day, the very last day, we were in Brazil, and we'd been there for 2 months, took a bit of a sort of roundabout route, and ended up going kind of a long, long way through Brazil and then out the southwest corner of it to Peru. And on that last day, I remember this guy saying, "Hey, you don't hitchhike like that. We only knew how to pick you up because we'd seen it in the movies. But here you hitchhike in a kind of using a motion, a kind of sticking your thumb sort of back and forth over your shoulder." And it was quite funny to be sort of told off for hitchhiking wrong after 2 months of doing it in Brazil and seeming to sort of get on just about all right.
So you mean you're like bending your arm at the elbow and swinging your thumb back and forth past your head?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it was. I think it was. The point was, you don't just sort of stand there just with the thumb hanging out, which is what we typically went for, because you probably get a bit tired just shaking it about the whole time.
He told us that we shouldn't be doing just the sticking out your thumb, because in Brazil that just means, "You all right? How you doing? Everything's good with me." It doesn't mean, "Please stop and give me a lift."
You write about hitchhiking etiquette. Again, something that didn't really occur to me. Can you give me some examples of what you mean by hitchhiking etiquette?
There are a couple of different contexts for this. One, it was if there are other hitchhikers around. And this actually only really happened in Argentina and Chile, where there were other foreigners and locals hitchhiking. And there the etiquette is first come, first serve, and make it clear who is first, and thereafter leave enough room so that as a driver is approaching, they can tell it's not a clump of 10 people trying to hitchhike together, but actually 2 or 3 together, and then 10, 15 meters up the road, the next group, just so that it's as clear as possible to the driver what the situation is.
Let's go back and talk about some of the countries that you went through. And I'm sure there's more to the adventure than just riding in cars. And maybe you can speak about some of that stuff and what you remember about some of these places. How about let's start in Argentina?
I'd just like to sort of start by saying I think that the beauty of hitchhiking is that, to me, it's like no other means of transport, because you are thrust into the arms of people that you don't know, and they then take it upon themselves to help you out. And also you learn a great deal about them and about the places you're in just through them. Whereas, say if you're driving through a place on your own, it's up to you to interact with the locals. But this way that it's kind of reversed, and I really love that. So that's why I love hitchhiking, and it gives you such a great insight into different cultures. So, and for example, Argentina we couldn't have picked a better place to start. It was wonderful. It still remains probably the highlight of the trip for us. We absolutely loved it. And I think it was typified by the last ride we had in Argentina, which went over 10 days with this couple and their 4-year-old daughter. And they were driving from their home in Buenos Aires. They picked us up kind of halfway between Buenos Aires and the border with Bolivia. And they were just sort of driving there for a holiday, a bit of a road trip, and stopping off in various places. And they picked us up maybe 1,000 kilometers south of the border, and then day by day they just sort of kept saying, "Oh, you can carry on coming with us if you want." And then after about 3 or 4 more days, we were invited to just go the whole way. By that point, it was kind of like we were part of their family, and that really seemed to be sort of quite typical for Argentina. I think they were just so kind and really gentle people with a really rich culture as well, which we loved. Lots of music, loads of songs, folklore songs that they all knew sort of off by heart, and you'd be in bars at night and they'd be sort of strumming these songs, all singing along, all dancing, and yeah, we loved it. And it was flipping stunning, just like Alaska on the other end. It was kind of, those were the two places that sort of blew our minds in terms of just sheer beauty.
That sounds like the dream come true of a hitchhiker, to have that many days in that sort of a great situation versus having to constantly change and find new drivers.
Absolutely. It was wonderful to have the surety that the next day we were secured a ride already without any uncertainty. For me, particularly with my personality, I love to know what's coming up. and that's the opposite of hitchhiking. And so to have such a long ride, also when we were with truckers and we knew that we would be with them for 1,000 kilometers or so, that again helped me to relax into the ride, compared to a day, for example, between Seattle and Vancouver, only 100 miles or so, but it took us 11 rides. And most of the time we were breaking the law on the freeway. So that for me was the opposite, and I really found it very difficult.
Did you ever run into any problems with law enforcement?
Yeah, but actually only in the States, and only which surprised us. I think we were thinking we might get into some trouble in sort of South America. You hear of, I'm sure probably you guys do as well as us, kind of these sort of stories of perhaps corrupt cops in perhaps Mexico or maybe Brazil. Actually, I mean we did have a few issues, sort of visa related issues in Brazil with what seemed to be a slightly corrupt police in Rio de Janeiro, which the guys there were saying was quite typical, unfortunately, of the cops in that particular part. But that was just a kind of administrative hiccup on our trip. Whereas, sort of in terms of hitchhiking problems with the law, that really only started in the States, and we really weren't anticipating it at all. We kind of arrived through Mexicali into this little place called Calexico, went across to San Diego, and I remember there we'd only had one ride to get to San Diego, so it was sort of our second ride in the States, and we were kind of thinking, right, what's this going to hold? We got onto the I-5 heading north, and we were thinking, right, what's hitchhiking in the States going to look like? And kind of hoping for the best, but not knowing. And then we had this one guy come up to us and sort of say, have you guys ever done this before in the States? We said no. He said, well, good luck, it's going to be hard, or something like that. And it's kind of the opposite of what you want to hear at that particular moment. But anyway, we did get a ride, and quite quickly, from this petrol station we were waiting at, just on the outskirts of San Diego. This guy, he picked us up. He said he'd hitchhiked quite a bit before, and the best idea for us was to go to freeway entrances. And so we were like, oh, great, fine. So we did that. He took us to one. We got picked up. It wasn't too difficult. And that sort of became our pattern until we got to San Jose, just south of San Francisco. And we were waiting at a freeway entrance. It was about 5 p.m. I think the sun was going to go down about an hour later. And we were kind of set on making it to San Francisco that evening. And then just standing there, and this cop shows up on his motorbike and puts the lights on, pulls over, gets off, and is holding a baton, and he's got his sunglasses on, and it's a really kind of sort of swaggers over to us. And we didn't realise we were doing anything wrong at all, but immediately it became clear that we must be. This was kind of really the worst possible thing that could have happened to Jo, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And in the sense that, I mean, for me, I sort of look at the law as a guideline rather than something that you necessarily need to follow to the letter. Whereas for Jo, it's the opposite. It's it's there. You've got to follow absolutely everything completely as it is. And so suddenly to then be told that what we were doing was breaking the law, that were the words he used, and that you're not allowed to hitchhike on the freeway. It's illegal. People get killed on the freeway every day, he said. And I said, well, where then can you hitchhike? And he said, well, 500 meters from any freeway. And it was kind of like in that instance, this kind of gut-wrenching, well, that's going to make it pretty much impossible then, because, who's going to pick you up just in the middle of a town? They're not going to know where you're going. You're going to have loads of issues. It's just practically impossible. So as soon as this guy went off on his motorbike, I kind of said about hitchhiking again, and then looked over my shoulder at Jo, who's sort of slumped on the side of the road and doesn't want to hitchhike again. So then we had this sort of compromise of, okay, we'll leave it for tonight and try and make a plan. That was certainly a hiccup.
When you were in the US, did you see many other hitchhikers?
We did, but they were always the end of the spectrum of homeless people who had their dogs with them. And it soon became clear when people picked us up that we stood out because we were a couple together. We had our backpacks with us. We looked clean and well kept. And in terms of the actual hitchhiking in the US, we found so much generosity and people willing to help. And I think it was partly because we stood out as doing something different to the other hitchhikers around.
Let's continue on talking about your travels to the north. Chile. What do you remember from Chile?
Chile is absolutely beautiful. I think we were very lucky in having a couple of different stints. So we went in right in the south, then back into Argentina, and then back into Chile further up towards Santiago. And because it's such a narrow country and so long, the landscape changes quite rapidly. And so you've got the mountain range, the Andes, on the east, and then there's the coast on the west. And we went through the wine growing region as well. And we didn't get into the desert region, but there's that in the north as well. So there's always something new. And the volcanoes as well were really striking and so different from anything that we have in England.
Bolivia, where hitchhiking does not exist, I wrote in my notes. How did your experiences change all of a sudden when you ran into this culture where hitchhiking doesn't seem to be a thing?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. And I think to make it sort of worse, it came from right on the back of this 10-day stretch we'd had with that couple in Argentina. And so we were kind of pretty relaxed, and we had a really great time. We were hoping for the best. And every country you go to, if you've never been there before, don't know much about it, obviously you're sort of hoping for the best, but there's a slight kind of trepidation. And I remember we did our sort of usual thing of first place we got to, so the border town, it's called Villazón. We picked up a map and then went to the tourist info place and sort of got chatting to her about the point to leave the city, where would be a good place to stand. And I can't remember exactly how she put it, but she basically said, you can't hitchhike here. And it's not the first time I'd been told that in a place, and most of the time, well, in fact, every time I'd been told that, it proved sort of incorrect. But at the same time, to be told it again is always discouraging. And it did prove actually quite a challenge.
I think because all transport is seen as public transport to an extent. So often people would be travelling in the back of a truck as part of their getting from A to B. They would treat that as a transaction. The locals would pay the driver. And we were very clear that we didn't want to pay for transport. Thankfully, because we'd mastered enough of Spanish to have a conversation before we left, we were able to say to drivers, are you willing to take us? We don't want to pay you. Inevitably in Bolivia, that meant ending up in the back of a truck and not interacting very much with the driver.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, because if you say to someone, we didn't want to pay for transport, the logic behind that, it's not that we're cheapskates. I mean, for example, it would probably have cost us, nothing, like $1 probably, to get this like huge ride or something. But that wasn't the point. The point was, as soon as you spend money on a transaction or for something like that, it becomes a transaction. It becomes a contract between two people, and so then they're only helping you out because you're giving them some money. And that's not what we were doing it for. We were doing it to meet people, to have the experiences we'd had in Argentina and Chile before. And so that was the tragedy, that suddenly it seemed that people weren't willing to extend their hospitality to us, and they weren't interested in meeting us, actually, particularly. It felt that way. Actually, what we did find is, as we went out of Bolivia to the east, having done a bit of a sort of loop, as tended to be our sort of way of doing things, we went up to La Paz in the northwest. Then we hooked to the right and went directly east out of Brazil. And as we went close to the Brazilian border for the last 600 kilometers, we suddenly found it was kind of like being almost back in Argentina and Chile. And suddenly we were able to stand on the side of the road and get picked up relatively easily, whereas previously we'd been waiting at tolls, so pay tolls, and sort of chatting to drivers to convince them to give us a ride. Yeah, suddenly, I don't know what it was really, but suddenly we found that, okay, maybe it's not so difficult. We thought to ourselves, well, if only we'd sort of entered Bolivia from the Brazilian border, we may have come out of Bolivia with a very different perspective on the country.
How did you become good at speaking Spanish? Did you study before you started the trip?
We did a bit of study. Both of us knew some French, which helped in understanding the structure. And we took a cassette tape, one of those relics of the past, and taught ourselves for 6 months the basics whilst sitting in our living room, running through verbs and grammar. And then from then on, it was on the road. The first conversation we properly had in Spanish was in our very first place in Argentina, buying a map. And after we'd bought it, we asked the man in English, how was our Spanish? And he encouraged us that he'd understood us. And away we went. And we were speaking it nearly every day for around 3 months. Then we switched into Portuguese, and we had not studied a word of Portuguese. But we were very pleased to discover that we could pick it up with a mixture of Spanish and French and understanding what the locals were saying. And then we switched back into Spanish for a further 2 or 3 months. So we are very good at telling our story in Spanish now.
Brazil. How long did you guys stay in Brazil?
Yeah, so we were there for 2 months.
Tell me about the experience there.
It was an experience. I mean, 2 months in any place is a lot's going to happen, I suppose. And we travelled a great distance. We did a huge sort of loop all the way from the eastern border of Bolivia, the west of Brazil, southwest of Brazil. Did a big loop, then went to Sao Paulo, Rio, and sort of up, and then exited via Peru in the southwest, very far southwest of Brazil. And it was, I mean, it's really difficult to sort of sum it up, apart from to say that I remember clearly the very first day we arrived in Brazil at this border town called Corumbá. I remember at the end of that day, I had declared that Brazil was my favourite country because the people were so friendly. They just seemed to have huge smiles on their faces. It was kind of exactly what I'd hoped for and thought might be the case for Brazil. And then over our time, for the first 10 days, I remember people looked after us. I think we had, for every single one of those 10 days, someone had invited us for a meal with them, either in a restaurant or at their home, and, a complete stranger. And so that was just incredible. So by the end of that time, I was saying, this is the best country in the world. But then, interestingly, over the next, 1.5 months, our opinion of the country, it started to lose its shine, I suppose. Perhaps that's what happens in any place once you're there for long enough to pick up its faults, I suppose. We began to become extremely tired of being told to watch our backs, which seems to be completely part of their culture. They're just so fearful, and understandably it seems, because they tell you all these stories that they have of either their friends or their family or themselves being kind of held up. So it's a really complex country where you've got these two sides, this wonderful friendliness, love of life, gentleness, beauty, and then the other side, this suspicion and fear. And it was so suffocating that I think by the end of that time in the country, we were pretty glad to get out.
The reason we went to Brazil, which was quite a detour from the straightforward route, was for the World Cup. And that was absolutely wonderful. That was the best of Brazil, to see the party atmosphere, to see them get behind their nation's football team. But at the same time, it typified this sense of good and bad and the tensions in Brazil, because there was such an obsession with the football team winning that when they lost quite catastrophically, there was uproar and devastation. And that seemed, in a nutshell, what our experience of Brazil was.
Did you get a sense when you were there of ever being in any danger? I know here, at least the story that we're told here is that Brazil can be quite a dangerous place. Did you ever sense that?
I don't think we did. I'm trying to think. I mean, it's really hard to remember feeling in danger at any point, really, on the trip, actually.
I would say we didn't personally ever feel threatened, but because of all of these stories we were told of our drivers being either personally involved or a family member being involved, that danger was never very far away. So there was always a cloud of it hanging over us.
Well, I remember in Rio, particularly in Rio, we had a plan to leave where we were staying. We'd been there for about a week, which was longer than we stayed in most places. But we were ready to leave, and I remember telling our hosts our plan. We'd looked on a map, which is our classic thing to do, picked up a map on the internet of Rio, had a little look at where we wanted to walk to get out of the city, and had an idea of our heads of, okay, we're going to take this road and just keep walking, basically. And when we told our hosts this plan, they were aghast. They said, "You cannot do that in Rio. It's so dangerous." And you know, that's, as we've sort of described, that was pretty typical of the experience as a whole in Brazil. That there was this sense of there was danger out there, but because we never really saw it. So in the end, these guys, they took us in their car to where we wanted to walk to, which was wonderful. You know, saved us probably 2-3 hours of walking to get out of the city. But at the same time, you know, and so I don't know, was it that we were lucky? Was it that we were sort of taken care of by God? I don't know. Or was it just that there wasn't actually this danger, and it's just a sense of the fear? It was difficult to sort of pin it down, I suppose.
When you say that when you're using these maps, are you using paper maps, or are you using iPhones and such to help you navigate?
We didn't take any devices with us, so we always bought paper maps. And then in terms of writing our blog and contacting family, every Sunday we would take a day off. We didn't do any hitchhiking, and we would find a church in the morning and an internet cafe in the afternoon. And that was our rhythm. So we, on our person, didn't have any electronic device, but we weren't very far away from it if we needed the internet.
Yeah, and then when it came to sort of leaving a city, like I described with Rio, we'd always look it up on the internet on that Sunday. So for the bigger cities, that was necessary to work out how to leave the city, because most of the maps didn't have a very good plan. It was relatively clear, or it would be signed, or you could ask someone. So those were the kind of tools that we used.
Tell me about Colombia.
Colombia was a funny one, because we were actually quite looking forward to going to Colombia, partly because in Brazil, I think, particularly in Brazil, they'd said, Colombia, if you think Brazil's friendly, then go to Colombia. It's the friendliest place in the world. And so I was particularly excited about this. I guess we probably were both a little bit fearful. Again, just that classic thing of being told so many times how dangerous a place is. We got there, and maybe we were just sort of tired by the journey at that point. I think we'd been on the road 5-6 months, something like that. And I think we were probably just a bit tired, because it never really caught us, Colombia. It sort of almost passed us by, and we found the hitchhiking aspect a bit of a slog. It was never really sort of very, very difficult. We weren't waiting often for longer than an hour, but at the same time, it didn't capture us in the same way as other places had.
I think the heat also started to get to us. The further north that we travelled, the more humid it was. And by the time we reached Cartagena, it was almost unbearable. We would have a shower, and within moments, we would want to have another shower. It was just so intense, the heat there. And that's, again, something that is draining, particularly if you are waiting in the heat for a lift. It can become very tiring. Having said that, again, the people were very friendly. We did see armed policemen around, but never again in a threatening way. They were at checkpoints, but they weren't unfriendly to us. It just seems that was part of the system in Colombia.
So when you are starting to feel a little bit burned out, what do you do? Do you say, we're just going to take some time off?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I don't know how often we got it on the road. I think Colombia is the one that I think of when I think about it. I mean, it just sort of so happened that Colombia was obviously getting to the very end of South America. And so we left South America and headed to Central America from there. So I suppose that was kind of a natural break for us. And the way that we had to leave South America gave us a bit of a break as well, because we had there is no road connecting Colombia and Panama. I think there's a sort of political reason for that. There's also a forest, but they could build a road through it if they wanted to. There's this stretch there. It's called the Darien Gap, and it's about 100 kilometers, I think, in length, and it separates the two countries through a forest, which is said to be, full of drugs and violence, and just not a good place to go. And so, one option, the heroic, fearless option, is to sort of walk your way through it. And I've heard of stories of people doing it, but it wasn't really ever on our list of things to do. And so we were forced then to catch a boat to get us between Cartagena and the first place in Panama. And that gave us, we were on the boat for probably 5 days, something like that. It's not actually that far to go, but they make a kind of tourist trip out of it. So you go and visit an island, or rather a set of islands. Is it called San Blas? Is that right? This island range, and it's beautiful. It's in the Caribbean. It's crazily warm, and so I think that just gave us the rest that we needed, perhaps, and set us up. I think beyond that, like you said, when we got burned out, I think we did just take a couple of days off. So sometimes, I remember this one time, particularly in Brazil, we'd had a really, really hard couple of weeks, which probably actually, again, tainted our perceptions of the country. Like just in hitchhiking terms, in the southern section in the state called Santa Catarina, we'd had a really, really hard stretch of just long waits, like 4 hours maybe before someone picks up, and just that sense of people passing you by without caring about you. And I think after that, we'd had this really long week, and we were a bit scarred sort of mentally and emotionally, and we took kind of 4 nights off just to get our heads back on track.
When you do take time off, that's going to impact your budget. And it's one of the things I wanted to ask about is, I know this can be an affordable way to travel. What's a realistic budget for someone that wants to start off hitchhiking? How much money should they have in their pocket at the beginning?
The short answer is it depends. And the sort of longer answer is, I think it's kind of, it's really up to you, because we met a guy actually in Nicaragua. It's one of those really chance encounters where we met this guy who was kind of doing what we were doing the opposite way around. He was hitchhiking down from maybe Georgia in the States and was going down to Argentina. But he'd decided that he didn't want to take any money at all with him. And so he was kind of taking our idea to the next level and deciding to really, really survive on the hospitality of others. That is an option. You can do that. And actually I did consider it. But at the same time, I decided I didn't want to be entirely dependent on others. I liked the aspect of you accepting their hospitality when it came to rides, or maybe them taking you in for the night. But I didn't want to be completely reliant on other people. And then in terms of just the sort of the budget that I went for, so for my England to Malaysia one, we set aside £10 a day each. So that's the equivalent of about $15, something like that. And that did us. And that was for a 6-month trip. So it only came to about £1,500 each, I think, $2,000, something like that. So not very much at all for 6 months. Whereas for Joe and me on this trip, we doubled the budget, partly because we're a married couple, getting slightly older. I mean, not old, still in our 20s at the time, but just wanting not to rough it completely, not wanting to camp every night. So we camped a few times, but we doubled it to still a pretty affordable £20 each a day. So again, probably $30. So maybe $60 between us for each day. And we did that for 9 months. That was our budget. And we'd saved up for that. And, it sort of balanced out. There were countries where that wasn't enough, like the States, for example, but there were countries where that was ample, like Bolivia. And so it sort of just balanced out.
I think you made a wise decision to bypass the Darien Gap. There's a magazine here in the United States called Outside Magazine. They recently did an article about a reporter went with some smugglers as they were trying to smuggle people through that area, and I think you would have run into some unsavory characters, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And in the back of our minds was always know your limits, and we do not have any extreme outdoors skills, not extreme in the least. So for us to tackle not only a mangrove rainforest, but also the potential of meeting unsavory characters, that was nowhere near what we wanted to do.
I think as well, it kind of just, at no point did I ever think, right, you're kind of breaking your rule, because the fact of the matter was there was no road. And so, yes, we could have decided to sort of wander our way through this forest and hope we made it out to the side. But yeah, I didn't feel like we were cheating by using the water on that particular stretch.
How did you find this sailboat, and where did it ultimately drop you off at?
There's a big tourist industry in Cartagena of these boats taking people up to Panama. So it was very easy to wander down to the marina. We gave it one go to see if we could get a free ride. So we asked around some of the boats. We also went to the cargo point and asked if we would be able to go on one of the cargo boats, and it was a big fat no from both. And at that point we were happy to accept we would have to pay. So we went to a travel agent and we booked on, and it was as simple as that.
You get dropped off in Panama and you go through Central America pretty quickly, 5 countries in 7 days. What do you remember about that time?
So we got dropped off in Panama at a place, I think it was called Portobello, and it's just to I get a bit confused with Panama because it's not north to south. It's kind of a strange shape on the map. I think it's maybe east to west with a little bit of a bend at both ends. Yeah, we got dropped off. It's sort of maybe 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers from Panama City. It wasn't our intention to sort of breeze through these places. We got a map, our standard map in Panama City, and it happened to be that the only map we could find was one of Central America at large. So the whole section between Panama and Mexico, not including Mexico. Perhaps because of that, I don't know, but it made it feel more like it was one country to us, even though they each have their own characteristics. But yeah, again, it wasn't sort of our plan to race through it. It's just the way it went, and the countries were, markedly smaller than the countries we'd been in before. So yeah, it was just sort of leaving Panama. It took us a few days to get out to Costa Rica, and then in Costa Rica we were planning to head to this place on the northwest coast where we knew someone, but actually the guy offered us a ride all the way through to Nicaragua in his truck, and we said, well, all right, fine. So then we were there, and then again in Nicaragua, it only took us a couple of days to get to the border with Honduras. And again, in Honduras, we headed to El Salvador via the shortest route, which there's a pretty short route, and we took it. And again, not really hearing many good things about Honduras. Again, perhaps true, perhaps false. We don't really know because we were only there for about a day. And then we went through El Salvador pretty quick and into Guatemala. I don't know what our overall impression of Central America was.
I distinctly remember the thunderstorms. They were the most almighty afternoon storms in which the lightning and the thunder would rage, and then the tap would turn off and it would be back to searing, sticky heat. And the one night we did spend in Honduras was in a police station, all above board. We couldn't find anywhere else to stay, so the police officers put us up. But there was this humongous storm, and all the armed soldiers started piling in to this small tin-roofed building. And it made us laugh to think that it must be a good night to smuggle drugs because all the armed guard of Honduras was sheltering from the rain.
About Central America, I'd say that I distinctly remember how wonderfully easy it was to hitchhike again once we'd got into Nicaragua. So Panama and Costa Rica, which happened to be, I think, the two richer nations in that little section, they were slightly harder. But as soon as we got into the poorer countries, Nicaragua, and particularly we didn't spend much time in Honduras, but El Salvador and Guatemala, it was so stupendously easy that it really revived us. I think we were probably still suffering a bit of burnout from, well, the whole trip, but particularly Colombia and the slog of hitchhiking there. That perhaps that was part of the reason why we kind of breezed through. But then it really revived us in Nicaragua, El Salvador and Guatemala. You'd be on the road for no more than 10 minutes at any stretch. It seemed like practically everyone wanted to pick you up. And there's just something so joyous about that. It kind of feels like it should be that way. It feels like, we're not causing anyone a threat. If you've got space, why wouldn't you pick someone up, help them out, and get to know each other? And that really felt, again, like we were back to where we wanted to be, why we were doing this thing. And so that was a real joy. So however brief our time was in Central America, we did leave with a really fond feeling.
Next, you go through Mexico. What do you remember about Mexico?
We had a great start to our time in Mexico, being taken in by this couple and being hosted by them over a weekend, introduced to their friends. It happened to be a Saints' Day celebration in their little town. So we went to the celebration with mariachis, the traditional band, and there was wonderful local food. And from there, the father of the girl took us on to our next place. So it was an excellent start, and we warmed into Mexico very quickly.
Again, the hitchhiking aspect, it makes a real difference in terms of your overall, or my overall perception of a place, how easy it is to hitchhike. And again, not only do I typically notice that the richer a place, perhaps the harder it is to hitchhike, the poorer, the easier. Typically, or generally speaking, you can say that hitchhike, if you can hitchhike easily in a place, it tells you a great deal about the overall culture, the sense of, okay, are people willing to help people out? Is there a general sense of friendliness? Is there fear? And, you can't generalize to the sense that, a whole country could be difficult or easy to hitchhike in, because it can depend on where you are. So I think in rural places, typically it's easier wherever you are. So we found that, in places in rural Brazil, it's picked up pretty much straight away, even though we'd had harder times down south. But yeah, again, I think in Mexico, so again, perhaps and in the bigger cities, slightly harder to hitchhike, but by and large, we found it much easier. And again, that really just lifted our spirits and enabled us to enjoy our time there.
I'm going to skip across the U.S. since we've already spoken about it, and tell me about your time going through Canada.
When we got into Canada, it really felt like we were sort of in this strange situation where the end was sort of in sight, but still very far away, because Canada is enormous, of course, and also the season was changing very rapidly. So it was early November when we arrived. It was quite a mild November in Canada, so we were lucky in that the usual snow level hadn't come and it was kinder on us. But nonetheless, we were starting to wrap up much warmer and anticipating travelling through vast distances with very little between them. So it was sort of with mixed feelings for myself.
Yeah, I think that was the crucial aspect of it as well. So you had the two things. You had the freezing cold, but you also had the fear that comes with really not knowing where the next place is. So we had our map, of course, and on our map, it seemed like there was just nothing. So, you had one little town, and the next place would be, 500 miles away. And you're thinking, hold on a sec, it's now a case of possible life and death. If you get stuck in between those places, no one can pick you up. We weren't particularly worried about, bears or moose or anything like that. But obviously that was, I suppose, a potential danger as well. But this sense that really we are very vulnerable. So because of that, we made a decision. We said, right, okay, we're just not going to accept rides unless we know they're taking us to a significant point. We're not going to take a ride. For example, we got offered one once to this guy's house, and he lives in a really rural place just outside of town. And we just thought, well, that would just not be a sensible option, because then you've made it to this guy's house and he seemed fine. I'm sure he'd have looked after as well, but we'd have been in a really remote area and we didn't want to start doing that. We wanted to stay in between towns.
Your final destination is Alaska. What did you think of Alaska when you finally made it there?
We loved Alaska, what we saw of it, which actually, as it happened, wasn't a great deal. But I can't talk about Alaska without sort of setting the scene slightly. And I mean, this was the culmination of our entire journey. It ended on this very memorable day for us. It seemed really quite fitting. It ended on a Monday through to a Tuesday. We'd had this absolutely huge ride with this guy called Chuck Pinkerton, who lived in Homer, Alaska. But we have to take it back a little bit further than that and tell you where we started the day, which was in this tiny place called Fort Nelson, which is still a good maybe 1,000 kilometers from the border with Alaska. And we'd stayed the weekend with this lovely couple called Steve and Leona, who'd looked after us, taken us to their church, put up flyers around the town asking if anyone was heading towards Alaska or even the next town, which again was like 500 miles away. They'd done everything. They'd even put it on their little community Facebook group. There was this lovely couple jabbering through, can anyone help them out? Nothing had come from that, but still, Leona got up early that morning, took us to the edge of Fort Nelson. About 8 a.m. we were standing out. It was minus 17 Celsius. I'm not sure whether that is in Fahrenheit, but it was cold. We were just waiting there. We'd been there for about 45 minutes, which is a long time to be standing out in that cold. And we were really quite scared. I think not scared about any danger beyond the fact that it just seemed so far away still. And we were so cold, and there was a whole lot of nothingness between us and Alaska, it seemed. We'd been told, I remember that the night before we'd been taken out for a drive by Steve. I remember him saying something about how, you're really in the middle of nowhere, and he'd really set this kind of bleak picture without wanting to scare us. But again, it added to this sort of sense that we really were in trouble. So when along came this 4x4 with a Alaskan number plate on and pulled over, and I saw the Alaska number plate before I went over to the driver, my heart sort of skipped, and I went over, asked him where he was going. He said Alaska, and I had to kind of control myself, or tried to control myself, and say, "Can we come?" And he was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And couldn't believe it. 1,000 kilometers away. And then when it just so happened that not only was he going to Alaska, but he was going to this place which is called the End of the Road in Homer, Alaska. It just felt so right. At the beginning of the trip, I'd sort of hoped, okay, maybe we'll end up in this place called Dead Horse, which is right at the top of Alaska, pretty much the furthest you can go. But by this point, sort of above the Arctic Circle, it was going to be pretty dark, if not completely dark, because it was late November by then. Also, it was really cold, and we'd also heard that you need a special permit to use this road to Dead Horse. So I kind of said to myself, I'm just not sure that's going to happen. We're really tired. We've been on the road for like 9 months. We're shattered, and we don't want to die. So I'd kind of said, right, whatever, Alaska will do. Wherever we get, that's fine. But when this guy ended up being so where Homer is, it's the southernmost point of the Kenai Peninsula, which is just south of Anchorage. And like I said, it's officially called the End of the Road, because I think it's actually the westernmost part of the road in the whole of the Alaskan road network, because there isn't a lot in Alaska. And so even though you're only probably about maximum half the way across Alaska, you're still kind of right at the edge. And that's why they call it the End of the Road, and it really just seemed perfect.
So what turned out to be the most unusual hitchhike that you took?
The most unusual hitchhike was with a family of goats. On the back of a truck in remote Brazil, we were on this little track waiting for a ride. It had been freezing overnight, and now it was switching to being boiling in the heat. And along came these farmers, and they didn't have any room in their cab, so they offered us to go with the goats in the back. So in we popped and sat as far away as we could from the goats and trundled off. It wasn't a long ride, maybe 20 minutes or so, but about 15 minutes in, one of the goats became untethered from his family, and I was quite nervous at this point that he might find us threatening. But thankfully, Steve wielded a shield in the form of a spade just in case he approached us, and we completed the ride in safety.
I was going to ask if they tried to eat your rucksacks or something.
No, I think they were quite happy to keep their distance, actually.
Well, I mean, this one did sort of he sort of staggered towards us. I mean, because we were moving along, so it wasn't particularly stable for the poor creature, nor for us. We were kind of like slumped on our backpacks against the far edge of this trailer. Yeah, I remember as he came over, so I picked up this spade which was in front of me and held one of my feet in the air, sort of again fending him off with these two things. But yeah, we survived.
Well, congratulations to you two for completing the journey.
Thank you.
When I was looking through your website, you mentioned Tier Fund and that you were doing this in part to try to raise some funds and awareness of this organization. What is Tier Fund?
Tier Fund is an NGO that I used to work for, and it's involved in sustainable development programs all around the world. We were lucky enough to visit one program in Bolivia and also another in Colombia. And they work with local people on local programs to increase capacity. So that might be education, or it might be agriculture, it might be water and sanitation. It depends on the country. Because my colleagues have been so supportive of mine and Steve's plan to do this program, I wanted to be able to give something back to them and the people that we met along the way.
In your opinions, what's the most frustrating part of hitchhiking?
Well, I think it's got to be the waiting and not knowing. I think for Jo, it would definitely be the sort of general not knowing. As a wait goes on and as that sort of pattern of waiting takes shape. So, for example, as I mentioned in Brazil, that week or 2 weeks where we just had day after day of really, really hard, long waits, that can be very frustrating. And I find it personally very, very difficult not to feel quite nasty thoughts about the people driving past, because I remember this one particular time in Brazil southern Brazil, where we were waiting in a petrol station for 4 hours, maybe 4.5 hours. And it was a really, really hot day. So we had our hats on to try and shield us from the rays. And we were it was such a busy petrol station on the motorway heading north. And we couldn't have been in a better spot, edge of the petrol station, cars going past us every probably 10 seconds. So there was just no reason why we should have to wait for 4.5 hours. It just turned out that for some reason it seemed like we were in this particular part of the world, particular part of Brazil where they didn't want to pick you up. And I find that very frustrating when I can't quite get my head around, there's nothing we can do. We can't help ourselves in any way.
The other occasional frustration is what comes from not being fluent in a language and miscommunication stemming from that. So if a ride was to a place where we hadn't expected, or where there was a misunderstanding about whether money was to be exchanged, usually those things were fine. Occasionally they were quite frustrating.
What did you find to be the most fun, the most enjoyable part of the adventure?
I think in sum, it was all the people that we met. 392 lifts is many more drivers and families and stories, and some we only got a glimpse into, some we were able to develop really strong and lasting friendships with. And there's so much fun and laughter that comes through those interactions.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. Whenever we stopped and we did this in, I think, every country, we'd sort of say what were your highlights, even in the countries, when we were there for a day. That was always the thing. It was never, okay, we saw this place like Christ the Redeemer in Rio. As amazing as that was, that wasn't the highlight. The highlight was the people we met.
If and when people ask you for advice on hitchhiking, what do you offer up to them?
Often our advice is very practical about how to make hitchhiking work for you. It's things like making sure you're standing as far as possible in a place where it's obvious which direction you're heading in, being visible to a driver standing in a place where they are able to safely slow down and pull in. Being visible in the sense of not wearing a hat that's covering your face or clothes that are hiding what you look like, so that a driver can assess you as quickly as possible.
I think I'd add to that you definitely need patience. And if you don't have patience, then you're going to learn it pretty quick, I think. So I think hitchhiking is good for learning that virtue. And also I'd say to anyone thinking of doing it that you've got to know what you want to get out of it as well. Because if you don't, then you could quite easily decide, right, I'm just going to give up. If you've got in mind, right, I'm going to go from here to here, I'm going to hitchhike, then, well, if you're like me, you're going to do that. And also, if you've got in mind that, okay, I'm going to hitchhike because it's going to give me this unique opportunity to meet people, to learn about people, to see cultures in a unique way, then if you've got those things in mind, it's going to really help your sticking power when it gets tough.
Steve and Jo, what's next for you?
Well, we've been back in London just over a year, and so we've been reconnecting with the things that we care about in England and enjoying what our own country offers us. And in the meantime, there's always a plot for another adventure, probably not on the same scale, my mum will be very pleased to hear, but always something little that helps us to explore somewhere new. We'd love to come back to the States and do some more of the West Coast under our own steam. We absolutely loved the Redwoods and that section of the West Coast. So to be able to go back for a couple of weeks or so and to see it again and explore a bit more depth, that's definitely on the horizon.
How can people find your books?
Well, I think Google's or any search engine, I shouldn't be Google specific, but the internet can help. So if you just search for our names and the name of the book, then hopefully you'll find your way to maybe Amazon where the book is listed, or as you mentioned, you could go via our website, theruleofthumbtwo.wordpress.com, and get in touch with us direct.
I didn't see, I could be wrong, a Kindle version on the American Amazon site. Is that in the works?
I think it should be. It ought to be in the works. We're not very good when it comes to the details of getting these things done. But yeah, it ought to be.
Yeah, that and the Spanish and Portuguese version, and also an audio version. They're on the long list of projects associated with this trip.
So tell us again how we can reach you online. What's your website?
So theruleofthumbtwo.wordpress.com, or I think we've got a Facebook page, which is just The Rule of Thumb 2.
Steve and Jo Dew-Jones, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing the story of your hitchhiking adventure, which you write about in the book, The Rule of Thumb 2, which you can find on Amazon.com. Thank you so much. Thanks again.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Recorded October 22nd, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.